What if you could understand a political leader's mind, like a computer's operating system? That's the fascinating idea behind Crispy Orvie's book, Inside Leader's Mind, Trump. The whole point is to try and reverse engineer a psychological profile, to see if it can predict future actions. So in this explainer, we're going to walk through the book's core arguments.
Okay, but first, the author puts this front and center, and it's absolutely critical. The goal here is to explain, not to excuse. The book's entire premise is that if we can trace the origins of someone's behavior, we can get a much clearer picture of where they're heading, and maybe, just maybe, predict what's coming next.
So how in the world do you build a model like that? Well, the book lays out a method it calls psychological archaeology. Think about it like this. You're digging backward, layer by layer, starting with the man we see today and going all the way back to the toddler he once was, trying to see how each experience shaped the next.
And this analysis is broken down into a pretty clear four-step process. First is the archaeology, digging into those early formative experiences. From there, it's about mapping the psychological mechanisms that result. The third step is recognizing the lifelong patterns that pop up again and again. And finally, you put it all together for modeling to try and predict future behavior. Let's follow that exact structure.
So let's start with the first and, according to the book, the most important layer of this whole thing. The author argues that to understand the entire psychological structure, you have to start at its foundation, which they identify as a deep, formative wound from very early childhood.
2.5. So what happened at age 2.5? Well, according to the book's research, this is how old Donald Trump was when his mother, Marianne, had severe complications after giving birth. She ended up hospitalized and was basically gone from his life for nearly a year and was apparently very close to death.
The book tries to frame what a child might experience in that situation with this quote. Citing psychoanalytic theory, the author argues that a sudden break like that, with your mother, can just shatter a child's sense of security. It basically teaches you, before you even have words, that the world is a dangerous place and abandonment can happen at any moment.
And the book argues that this wasn't just a one-off trauma. It points to other factors, like the well-documented emotional style of his father, Fred Trump. Based on all of this, analysts cited in the book estimate Trump's Adverse Childhood Experiences score, the ACE score, which measures childhood trauma, is at least a 6. That's a number that's correlated with a whole range of difficult outcomes later in life.
So how does a little kid survive an environment like that?
Well, according to this analysis, you build armor. You construct this protective shell of defensive psychological mechanisms around that original wound to make sure nothing can ever hurt you like that again.
A key part of this armor, the book says, was forged at New York Military Academy. It highlights this really contradictory lesson he would have learned there. On one hand, you have the official ideals of honor and sportsmanship, but on the other, the real lesson was that winning is all that matters. This experience, the book says, reinforced a belief that rules are flexible if they get in the way of a win.
And here's another piece of that psychological armor, the whole self-made billionaire story. The author points directly to a New York Times investigation that documented Trump received what would be at least $413 million in today's money from his father's empire. The book presents this self-made narrative as a really powerful defense against seeming weak or dependent on anyone. All of this leads to a core concept from clinical psychology that the book relies on heavily: the false self. The idea here is that this isn't the real, authentic person, but a persona you build for survival. The author argues that this facade of the tough, invincible winner was constructed specifically to protect that fragile, wounded kid inside from ever being hurt again. So you have these defenses, this armor. How does that shape behavior over a whole lifetime? The book's argument is that these early survival strategies basically hardened into a rigid operating system, a psychological algorithm that dictates how he responds to everything. And, the author claims, it really hasn't changed in decades.
You know, the book actually uses Trump's own words to back this up. In this quote, he's framing this consistency as a strength. The author, though, sees it differently. They interpret it to mean that the emotional defenses he built as a little boy are the exact same ones he's using today on the world stage.
Now, the book uses a pretty heavy clinical term in its analysis: malignant narcissism. And it's really careful to say this isn't meant as an insult, but as a specific psychological framework. It was first identified by the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, and it describes a syndrome that combines 4 things: narcissism, antisocial behavior, paranoia, and sadism. The book argues that using this lens gives us real predictive power.
This leads us to what the book calls a core piece of software in the operating system, the revenge algorithm. The author claims it runs on 3 simple, unbreakable rules. 1. All attacks, or even perceived slights, have to be counterattacked. 2. The counterattack has to be bigger, way more powerful than the original attack. And 3. There's no time limit on revenge, ever.
So what about this operating system's relationship with the truth? The book points to the Washington Post's database, which tracked over 30,000 false or misleading claims during his presidency. The author's take is that this isn't just about lying. It's evidence of a strategy where truth is purely a tool, something you use to build the reality you want.
Okay, so if the psychology is a fixed operating system with these hard-coded rules, what does that mean for the future? This is where the whole analysis pivots to prediction. The author argues that once you understand this rigid code, future behavior becomes, well, highly predictable, especially when the pressure's on.
Remember this one from the 2016 convention? It's presented in the book as the perfect expression of that false self we talked about. The author really zooms in on those 2 words, I alone, interpreting them as the sign of a mindset that just can't share credit, can't trust institutions, and sees power as something deeply personal that can't be divided.
And in the same way, the book looks at this more recent quote and says, hey, listen up, this is more than just a campaign slogan. The argument is that this should be read as a literal promise to fire up that revenge algorithm we just outlined, but this time using the full power of the presidency to do it.
So the book's final conclusion is basically this. All these patterns, the grandiosity, the revenge algorithm, the use of truth as a tool, they aren't bugs in the system. The author claims they are the system. They are the core architecture. And because of that, the book predicts future behavior is just going to be a direct continuation of past behavior, only amplified by whatever new context he's in.
And the book closes its analysis with this really haunting question, which is attributed to Trump's mother, Marianne. Now, it might be apocryphal, we don't know for sure if she said it, but the author includes it to bring this whole massive psychological blueprint right back to its human origin. It really leaves us thinking about this tragic feedback loop between a private childhood wound and its very, very public consequences. What happens when a child's unresolved pain is given the power to reshape the world?